Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 5. The topic today is two theories of crime, rational choice theory, that I always abbreviate as RCT in lectures, and routine activities theory, which I abbreviate as RAT throughout the lecture. So these theories I've grouped together and decided to talk about them right after the lecture about deterrence theory because these theories can really be thought of as falling along the same lines and being in the same family of theories with deterrence theory. So if you remember from last time, deterrence was based on this idea that people make rational decisions when they act. What this means is that people's actions, we think, will tend to align with their preferences. In other words, making a rational decision just means that you're acting in a way that aligns with what you want to be doing. If you recall from the ideas of Jeremy Bentham, we are all what he calls hedonistic, self-serving. And he described the rational decision-making process as a kind of hedonistic calculus, meaning that we all naturally act in ways that we think will produce benefit for ourselves, give ourselves some kind of advantage, or give us some kind of pleasure. That basis, which is also, for the most part, the basis of deterrence theory, is also the basis for the ideas in rational choice theory. Now, Jeremy Bentham's work was influential in building this idea of rational choices, and he believed that we all operate based on the expected utility that we hope to get out of doing something, meaning that we act naturally in ways that we think will produce benefit for ourselves. Now, again, Bentham is somebody who was writing in the 1700s, and for himself, he was mostly just interested in these overarching ideas and discussing human nature. In the late 1960s, an economist named Gary Becker was one of the first people to really explicitly talk about how these ideas of Bentham's can be related to criminal behavior. So he took the ideas from the basics of economics and from the ideas of philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and applied them to criminal decision-making. Essentially, what Gary Becker said was that if the expected utility of a crime outweighs its expected costs, we will probably commit that crime. If the benefits that we see coming out of committing a criminal act far outweigh any expected costs that might come from committing that criminal act, it's very likely that we're going to do it. In other words, for Gary Becker, everyone basically acts as amateur economists making decisions throughout their lives, and this can be very well applied to the decisions that one makes in committing crimes. Now, because Becker was an economist, and because the larger scale studies of deterrence were taking off around this time, in the late 1960s, studying individual decision-making was kind of put on the back burner for a while. If you recall from last class, the late 1960s and early 1970s is when deterrence theorists were doing state-level, aggregate-level research on decision-making. So the ideas of Gary Becker really didn't become heavily influential until a few decades later in the late 1970s and 1980s. And if you remember from the last lecture, in the mid-1970s, this is when those ideas from deterrence theory really shifted down to an individual micro-level examination. In other words, in the late 1980s, this is when we finally started to be interested in trying to understand decision-making at the individual person level. So, at this time period, the late 1980s, an evolution of deterrence theory happened to what we now call rational choice theory. So that's going to be the first theory that we go through in depth in this lecture. Now, rational choice theory was really formally stated for the first time by two researchers called Cornish and Clark. They wrote a book in 1986 called The Reasoning Criminal, where they introduced these ideas that we now call rational choice theory. So for them, rational choice theory was a theory designed to explain two different processes that are relevant to criminal behavior. The first process is the criminal involvement model. We'll go into each of these in detail, but for now what I want you to understand is that the criminal involvement model was their way of saying that rational choice theory can explain the overall decision that a person makes over time to enter into a life of crime. So the criminal involvement model is explaining someone's overall involvement in criminal activity. The second process that they believed rational choice theory could explain were crime-specific decisions. Now, in this way, what they mean is that individual choices that go into committing specific criminal incidents can be also explained by the overarching theory of rational choice theory. Cornish and Clark also brought up some points that really hadn't been formally stated before, firmly placing their theory in decision-making and choice-based theory. For example, they really saw people as being extremely active in shaping what they do and how they do it. In other words, actors, according to them, who you could consider all of you and people who might commit crime, create the situations that they're in and make decisions on how to respond to situations. So it's a much more, this theory is a lot more about bringing the accountability and the reason for committing crime to the decision-making of individual people. And similar to deterrence theory, they really see the basic motivation for committing crime to be pretty simple. People commit crime because they think they're going to get some benefit out of it. So offenders seek to benefit themselves with crime. I told you last time that we would get back to talking about rationality in much more detail, because rationality plays, obviously, a big role in a theory called rational choice theory. Specifically, an interesting area of the theory, as Cornish and Clark introduced it, was the idea of what they called bounded rationality. Cornish and Clark explain that everyone operates most of their life on bounded rationality. What they mean by that is, in many different situations, criminal and non-criminal, we make most decisions, cost-benefit analyses, based on incomplete or inaccurate information. In other words, when you make the decision to do something, you can only use the information that you have at your disposal to make that decision, which sometimes means you might not have a complete assessment and understanding of the full consequences and the full benefits of anything that you do. So the theorists are not assuming that people always have an accurate idea of the costs and benefits of crime, but they are assuming that whatever information we have in our heads, this plays a critical role in committing crime. It doesn't mean that a person isn't rational if they don't have all the information to make the best decision, but as long as they're making a decision that's in line with their preferences, you can consider it a rational choice. So it's called bounded rationality because in every decision we make, criminal and non, we are bounded by the information that we are made aware of before we decide to act. This is their way of explaining why some people commit crimes that most people would consider stupid and not worth the reward given the consequences. Not all rational decisions are necessarily good decisions, but as long as the person is acting to get what they want, you can consider it a rational decision. So again, as you might expect, theorists like this idea, and the ideas of rational choice theory and this idea of bounded rationality, because there are many decisions in committing crime that a lot of us might see as bad decisions. What I want you to do now is, as soon as this part of the presentation ends, click on the next video available, which is called The Liquor Store Burglar. Now, this is a YouTube posting and one of my personal favorites of security camera footage of somebody trying to burglarize a liquor store. My point in showing you this is, As you watch this person attempt to burglarize this liquor store, think about all the different kinds of decisions that went into this burglary attempt. Think about the decisions this person made on the fly, and think about the decisions that he must have made before committing the criminal act. I think it's a good example of the idea of bounded rationality.